Starting with the 1660s. Back then, many people were not aware of the dangers of fires, especially before the Great London Fire. Therefore, buildings were constructed out of timber wood. This type of wood was covered in a substance called pitch, which was highly flammable. The city had many sheds as well, which were packed with hay, which spreads fire very quickly. London was a somewhat large city, with a massive population of approximately 350,000. In the 1660s, there were also no cars or buses back then, making transportation a lot harder. Also, firefighting in 1666 was not very organized, and it required little to no skill or knowledge. The tools used for firefighting in the 1660s consisted of leather buckets filled with water and axes. It was September the 2nd on the day the fire started. It seems like a sunny morning in London when the King's baker, Thomas Fariner, was in the King's bakery at 2 a.m. The bakery was located on Pudding Lane, near the London Bridge which crossed over River Thames, a massive body of water. The exact cause is unknown. It is likely to have been a spark or ember from one of the Fariner's oven that accidentally set fire to a pile of fuel or oil, and there it began. This small spark ignited a grand flame, which slowly but surely set the building on fire. People were not very concerned at first, since fires had been very common at the time. The fire from the bakery began to spread with help from some strong winds from the east. The fire later spread from the east side of London to the west side in a few hours, which raised many more concerns. The most famous landmark destroyed by the fire was most likely St. Paul's Cathedral, since many people visited that church at the time and it was very famous. To make matters even worse, during the year of the fire, the city of London was suffering a drought, making water scarce and wooden structures became easier to burn. People fled in many different directions to escape the fire, depending on where they lived in the city. By the end of the fire, officially recorded deaths vary between 6 and 9, although this number is disputed by historians. Those in power at the time tried to play down the true death toll. Many people would not have been officially registered, such as foreign workers and the poor. And to register a death, you had to pay a fee. As you can imagine, many people didn't bother. Samuel Pepys was a witness of the Great Fire who wrote his perspective in his well-known diary in the form of a diary entry. He was born on February the 23rd, 1633 in London. His first entry about the fire was written on September the 2nd, on the day of the fire, and it speaks of how one of his maids, named Jane, woke him up in the morning to tell him about a great fire that they had seen going on in the city. She also later says that around 300 houses have already been burned down. Pepys got on a high tower to get a better view. He then comes down and the lieutenant guarding the tower tells him that it all started in Pudding Lane and has already burned the St. Magnus's Church. The St. Magnus's Church was a church nearby the bridge and Pudding Lane. He also later described how everyone began scavenging any goods they could get. His next entry on February the 24th, 1667, describes how he was asking people what the cause of the fire was, and it seemed as if everyone had been told that the baker was not owning up to the fire. Thomas Fariner said he did not leave on his stove, however. By 2 a.m., he said he felt as if he'd been choking by the smoke, so Fariner got up to save himself and his family. As a direct result of the Great Fire of London, building regulations were improved and many new beautiful buildings were built. Also, the first fire brigades were formed. These were initially private brigades, paid for by annual insurance, therefore only available to the rich. However, these insurance brigades led eventually to the formation of a public fire service, London Fire Brigade, 200 years later in 1866. Statistically, 13,200 houses, 87 churches, and 52 livery company halls, such as courts and civil administration buildings, were destroyed by the fire. The 13,200 houses burned were approximately 80% of all the houses in London. The Rebuilding Act was passed by Parliament in February of 1667. There were 6 people appointed in order to redesign the city. These 6 people were Robert Hooke, Hugh May, Robert Pratt, Edward German, and Peter Mills. This act proposed that new buildings needed to be built in replacement to the ones burned. It also proposed that every new building must be made out of brick or stone, that way it can resist against upcoming fires better. A major change that was proposed in the Rebuilding Act was that all buildings were limited on the amount of stories they could have in order to prevent another fast-spreading fire. There would be a call later on to all carpenters, bricklayers, masons, joiners, and plasterers in order to help with the reconstruction of London. Several proposals and sketches were made after the fire so that they would have a layout for rebuilding the city. The city had to get back on their feet quickly, so they began rebuilding the city as soon as possible. A few days after the fire, several people wanted to propose the reorganization of London streets. A few streets had been widened and a few streets were being made as well. Many people made designs for the streets and layouts. However, the layout that passed was by Christopher Wren, which was inspired by the Gardens of Versailles. By the end of 1670, approximately 6,000 houses out of the 13,200 burned had been rebuilt. Also, 7,000 buildings used for retail and government purposes had been rebuilt. Then by 1676, the entire area affected by the fire had been rebuilt. However, there had been around 20% less houses than before the fire. Some timber had been allowed in the houses and structures, but only for roofing purposes. There was later a second Rebuilding Act, which proposed the rebuilding of churches and parishes. They ordered the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral along with 51 other parish churches. Only 23 of the churches built still remain standing today. Robert Hooke and Christopher Wren made the design which was chosen for the monument of the Great London Fire. Construction of this monument began in 1671, and it took nearly 6 years to be completed. This monument still stands today and is a great place to visit. It also reminds us of the triumph and tragedy London faced in 1666.